Is it working now? I'm
Yes.
sorry. So I was saying before addressing the question of the impact of the event in the Arab world on Israel and how Israel might react to them, let's just spend a few minutes on where we are today with the tumultuous events that have shaken the Arab world over the last 12 months. First of all, sort of a truism, it's very much a work in progress. Only the first chapter in a multi-volume book, and I think the early enthusiasm about the pristine days of the Tunisian uprising and then the Egyptian uprising certainly have given way to something very different, in which many of what the key features of the uprising, that's non-violence, the fact that they were very much indigenous without any foreign intervention, the fact that they were unanimous or at least consensual movements, much of that has given way as we moved from Tunisia to Egypt to Libya to Yemen to Bahrain and Syria. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I think it's important to look at the background, but also to understand that in some ways the Arab uprising has become a combination of two phenomena, at least. One is a complete political rebargaining of the social contract in virtually every Arab country, and that is affecting the domestic political balance of power. But added to that has been a complete renegotiation of the strategic balance of power in the region because of what's happened in Egypt and because of what's happening in Syria and because of what's happening in Bahrain and so on and so forth. And the two obviously interact. In other words, changes at the domestic level in Egypt, in Syria and elsewhere are affecting the balance of power strategically in the region because of the changes of regimes and of outlooks that entails. And conversely, of course, the competition on the regional level is affecting how countries are positioning themselves in the domestic struggle for power. Again, in Syria, where you see Iran and Hezbollah taking one side and the West taking another side. In Bahrain, where you see Iran taking one side and the West perhaps not being as forceful in its support for democracy movements on the other. So it's the interplay of this political, domestic, and the strategic regional which makes it all the more complex, difficult, and ambivalent in the reactions of foreign countries. True, and I think it was very much said at the beginning, at the outset of these uprisings, they're not about foreign policy. Fair enough, but to say that that's not going to affect foreign policy, it's as if to say that if Mitt Romney were elected president, certainly he wouldn't be elected on the basis of foreign policy. It certainly would have a huge impact on America's foreign policy, just as the fact that these uprisings in the Arab world, which don't have much to do about foreign policy at the inception, are having and will have great impact on foreign policy, which is why a country like Israel must, or Turkey and Iran, are looking at this through that dual prism of what's happening domestically and how it's going to impact the regional balance of power. So with that background in mind, now let's turn to Israel. If you were sitting in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem and looking at the regional landscape and trying to figure out what's changing and how it's going to affect your calculations, I'd say there are about 6 features of this new environment that would come to mind from an Israeli point of view. The first is, as I was just saying, the great uncertainty and unpredictability of the situation in the region, which is a real challenge to Israel's strategic outlook, because it's a strategic outlook that has been based historically on the notion of preempting threats. This is not a Bush doctrine. It's very much an Israeli doctrine. You preempt threats and you take action about them. But in order to do that, you need to have a pretty good sense of what those threats are and how they're going to unfold. It's almost impossible to do so when you don't even know what the character of the regime in which the threat might appear might be in a year's time. It's one thing for Egypt to develop a certain strategic posture if you have President Mubarak or General Tantawi in power. It's very different if you have the Muslim Brotherhood. So the whole strategic concept on which Israel has sort of relied over the last several decades is challenged by this unpredictability and uncertainty of the landscape. Second feature is the greater role, unprecedentedly greater role, of public opinion in Arab countries. Whether we move towards democracies or not is not really the question. It's the fact that you have an actor that wasn't able to play the kind of role it wanted to play that is now in a position to influence foreign policy and strategic choices. And that, of course, has a direct impact on Israel because one of the issues that is going to guide public opinion in the Arab world is the question of Palestine. Again, that's different from saying that people care that much on a day-to-day level about what's happening to the Palestinians. But the question of Palestine, the symbolic question of Palestine, the psychological, moral question of Palestine, weighs heavily on how public opinions act. And I'll just take one anecdote, which I'm sure Omer could say much more about in a few minutes. The Turkish model, what Erdogan and the AKP represented in the region, might have been popular or could have been popular for many years. You had a case of an economically vibrant country that had managed to bring an Islamist movement to power, in which the military was slowly being put back in its barracks. But that model didn't really inspire the Arab world. Turkey began to inspire the Arab world when Erdogan took on Israel. It's when he walked out of his meeting with Shimon Peres at the Davos Forum. It's when we had the flotilla. It's when Turkey started to speak loudly about the Palestinian cause. That's what gave Turkey its resonance and its leadership today, its resonance in the Arab world. Not all the other things that Turkey could be proud of. I think it's just an anecdote, but that combined with other things we're seeing today in the Arab world tell us that the question of Palestine still resonates more deeply than any other. And it's going to be very hard for any aspiring political leader in any of these countries to try to gain any capital by advocating normalization or by advocating peace with Israel. I'm not foreseeing breaking treaties. I'm just saying that it's not going to be a very popular stance today to say that we need to reach out to Israel. And that's going to have obviously a big impact on how Israel measures its situation and assesses its situation in the region. Third feature, which is directly related, is the rise of Islamism. The Islamic ascent, which many had sort of, again, one of the truisms at the beginning of the uprising was to say, this is not about Islamism. Some of us challenged it at the time. I think now it's become quite evident, in fact, surpassing my own expectations of how well Islamists are doing in Tunisia, in Egypt, and Morocco, and elsewhere. And that certainly is a feature that Israel is looking at extremely carefully and somewhat warily, if not very warily, and particularly because they see that it's becoming a wave that is going to force the West itself to reevaluate and reassess its relationship with Islamism, perhaps even force Israel to reassess its relationship with Islamism. In Egypt to begin with, perhaps if you start with Egypt, Palestine and Hamas can't be too far behind. Fourth feature is reduced margin of maneuver. When I was in Israel a few weeks ago, people were speaking very openly about the fact that had the events in Eilat, the terrorist attacks in Eilat, or the rocket attacks from Gaza happened several years ago, Israel's response would have been much more aggressive. Much harder to do now when Egypt is on the cusp, when Egypt is in a period of transition, and when Israel wants to make sure that it's not going to do anything that's going to push either the SCAF or Egyptian public opinion even more violently, again, or in a more hostile stance. So it has to be careful now in measuring what it does. It can't simply calculate what a Mubarak might do or a King Abdullah might do. It also has to think about the more complex dynamic of how it's going to affect public opinion and therefore how it's going to affect the actions of leaders who have their eyes much more focused on public opinion than they do on Washington these days. The fifth feature is a declining U.S. and Western influence. Again, it follows from everything I've said before. President Obama can't pick up the phone and speak to an Egyptian leader and tell him what he wants to be done or what he hopes to be done, because the calculations are much more complex, because relations with the U.S. now have become much more delicate. Now, the declining U.S. role in particular is a much more long-term secular process, probably goes back many, many years, with two accelerators. One was the Iraq War, which discredited the U.S. and weakened its posture both militarily and morally in the Arab world. But the second accelerator is the Arab Spring, because it gives the U.S. much less leverage, much less familiarity with the new actors, and a much less powerful position or leverage with which to influence actors on the ground. And that too, of course, is going to impact how Israel views the region. And the final characteristic or new feature of this region is, if not the end of the peace process, but we could talk about that more, certainly its dramatic transformation. Dramatic transformation because Palestinians now are looking at the rest of the region and seeing a future horizon very different from what they saw before, the people I mean, but because the leadership no longer can rely on the leaders it relied on before either. President Abbas can't look to President Mubarak as the kind of ally he looked at before, and more broadly because the entire paradigm of the peace process since Oslo was built around the notion that you're going to have these quote-unquote pro-American moderate Arab leaders who would bolster the peace process, who would give cover to the Palestinian leadership, and who would reassure the Israelis that ultimately if there was a peace deal, then Arab leaders would come in and normalize relations. That's the very foundation of the Arab Peace Initiative. You could forget that, at least for now. Who are the Arab leaders who are going to stand with President Abbas in the event of a peace treaty? You have King Abdullah of Jordan, who never had the kind of the role and influence that others had. But are you going to have a General Tantawi? Are you going to have King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia? Who will be there to give the kind of credibility and legitimacy to an agreement, when on the other hand, you likely will have, or a peace process, forget even an agreement, you'll have Al Jazeera and other Arab media denouncing it, whatever happens as either at best a farce, at worst a betrayal. So the whole structure of the peace process, which was perhaps defunct for a long time, but certainly today I think it's become much more clear that there's going to have to be a reinvention of the paradigm, because what it was based on in the past, strong Arab leaders who could bolster Abbas and who could reassure Israel, strong U.S. role, all of that is now in question. So given all this, how is Israel going to react? If you look at this, some people have argued that, well, the Arab Spring is good for Israel, good for Israel's leadership today because it advances democracies. Under the Friedman Law, democracies are less likely to go to war with other democracies because Islamists are going to have to govern, and therefore they're going to be less interested, or just in general, militants are going to be less interested in being hostile to Israel because they have to focus on the domestic affairs, because it means that any future agreements will be reached with real legitimate representative governments and therefore will be more solid, and because it will bring down a regime like the Assad regime in Syria and therefore weaken Iran and Hezbollah. So that's sort of the good news story. There's a bad news story, which from today's perspective in Israel, and given the features I just described, I think is much more likely to be the prism through which Israel views the Arab world. A world in which pro-American leaders have been toppled, in which the margin of maneuver of leaders has been reduced because they have to take into account public opinion, in which popular feelings, of which a basic trope has been hostility to Israel, have been empowered, in which Islamists are on the ascent, in which regimes today may not be there tomorrow. Look at Jordan, it may not be there tomorrow. And in which the notion of popular uprising may very well spill over to the Palestinians themselves, and they may perhaps someday embrace the notion of a nonviolent popular uprising in Palestine, and because uncertainty and the collapse of authority will multiply areas of lawlessness and statelessness, as you see in the case of Sinai and the transfer of weapons from Libya and Sinai to Gaza and elsewhere. So the more likely read of these two prisms, the most likely one through which Israel is going to look at the region, in my view, is the latter one, which accounts for Israel's reaction so far. Say very little, do very little, and what you do very cautiously. And that, I think, summarizes how Israel has reacted so far. Sort of a hunker-down mentality, not a time to take risks, not a time to do anything when we don't know whether those with whom we will be dealing today will be there tomorrow. Perhaps tomorrow we'll have a different regime, certainly in Egypt, maybe in Jordan, maybe in some Gulf states, and perhaps even in Palestine itself. So the notion that Israel is going to seize the moment and decide now is the time to make peace with the Arabs and the Palestinians, because therefore we could strengthen the secular moderate forces and weaken the Islamists, I don't buy it, and it certainly is not what I feel when I go to Israel these days. I think more likely, perhaps, and I'm sure Kareem will speak about it, a more likely reaction, if Israel were to do anything bold today, it would be on the Iranian front, looking at what it considers to be a dangerous horizon, looking at the fact that there are elections here, which means that the U.S. is going to be less likely to take a forceful stance. The fact that the U.S. has withdrawn from Iraq means that logistically it may be easier to reach Iran. And the fact that the Arab world is distracted with its own problems and more worried, and certainly in the case of Gulf Arabs, more worried about Iran today than they were yesterday, may give Israel the opportunity to do what it believes it needs to do at some point anyway, which is to stop Iran's nuclear program. So this is a picture of a landscape that from Israel's point of view is almost entirely bad news, with the exception of Syria, but even Syria itself doesn't seem at this point to be going anywhere very fast. But that's not a situation in which I suspect the Israeli leadership is going to be looking for opportunities to reach out, but much more likely to look for reasons to hunker down. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Kareem, would you like